Brilliant. Well, welcome back everyone. I hope you had a really lovely break and were able to grab yourselves some refreshments. We are going to dive straight into our second panel now, which was going to be exploring opportunities to break bias and build understanding within our organisations, using diversity of thought to create a more fulfilling working environment for everyone. I'm delighted to welcome our panel host, Dame Sue Gray, and our wonderful panellists to the stage. Please join me in welcoming them.
Right, welcome everyone, and to our second panel discussion where we will be exploring the theme of breaking bias and building understanding. So for those that I haven't had the pleasure of meeting, I'm Dame Sue Gray, formerly an engineer in the Royal Air Force for nearly 37 years. Following that, I'm now looking into the nuclear and energy resource industry and trying to improve sustainability, but one of my key themes throughout my career in the Air Force has been around STEM advocacy as well as diversity and inclusion. As you can imagine, being a female in a male-dominated, non-neurodiverse environment in the early years for sure, it's good to see that even the services now are looking at the opportunities and benefits that are more diverse, and I would say also in society, but thinking that a more diverse community can bring. The challenge, however, for the military is how to create a neurodiverse team that can react in an instant. Having trained together, knowing exactly what needs to be done, when and by whom, when there's no time to communicate more broadly, I would suggest that this is a bit of a challenge. It must be instinctive. So how do we build that instinctive, inclusive behaviour? And today we gather to unravel those complexities of biases that may inadvertently arise within our workplace, hindering the full potential of our teams. Our fantastic panellists here, who will introduce themselves in a moment, experts drawn from various engineering perspectives who will share their insights and reflect on practices that they are keen to see mirrored across our profession. And I would add, again, more broadly across society. So I'd like to begin by giving each of you the floor and asking you to share your thoughts on biases within the physical working environment. Over to you. Can I start with you then, Leslie?
Hi, good afternoon, as I think it just about is now. So my name's Leslie Lawrenson. I work at MBDA Missile Systems. I'm Chief of Staff in our engineering department in the UK. My reason for sort of being here is rooted in being a female engineer in a defence industry environment, but particularly having reflected and looked back on my early career and the things that I didn't realise at the time, the impacts that the biases were having on me, and wanting to help others who are now in that position, having been through that reflection, to both understand and address some of those barriers. To your question on the physical environment, I think it's really important we address the big things as well as the small things. That could be literally being able to open a door if you have a disability, as well as figuratively. For me, one of the key things around aspects like that is making sure that we make these adjustments, and actually I struggle with the word adjustment, before somebody needs it, because there's nothing less inclusive than saying, tell me what you need, and then we'll put it in place. Actually, we need to put those things in place before somebody needs it, and that's what will make them feel included. I think also we could talk about open plan offices, and I think it was touched on in the first panel. The environment needs to be flexible. We need those options for the people who need the buzz. They need the noise and the contact for their innovation, which is so important to us in engineering. But also those who need the quiet, they need the lack of distraction so that they can be innovative, and we need to have that flexibility. And I think just the last point is a really subtle one of things like chair design. And this is a really good one for me because I'm quite short. And actually, luckily, these chairs are quite comfortable and my feet touch the ground. But the impact of being uncomfortable, whatever it is that makes you uncomfortable, whether it's a big thing or a tiny thing, distracts you from being the best you can be, from contributing the maximum that you can contribute, and therefore performing as well as you can. So that would be my opening statement, is we really need to think about that impact that allows everybody to deliver everything that they've got.
Thank you, Leslie. And Natasha?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. So I'm Natasha Whitehurst, pronouns she, her, and I lead inclusion and diversity at Rolls-Royce globally. And that in itself is a great starting point because we're 49 countries at last count, 44,000 people. So that's a lot of people to bring on the journey to creating an inclusive workplace. For me personally, so I've been at Rolls-Royce for just over 12, 18 months now. And prior to that, I've worked in D&I for a long time. And actually, when I first joined Rolls-Royce, I remember one of the first things that someone said to me was, everybody here is neurodivergent. And I was like, oh, that's a sweeping statement. Okay. And I said, okay, well, tell me, what are the numbers? And they were like, oh, we've not quite got the total numbers yet. And I was like, okay, so there's a starting point. But it leads me on to the foundations of any kind of focus in and around inclusion. And that is that it starts really with those foundational behaviours, values, and creating systemic change within the organisation. And that's something that we're really focused on at Rolls-Royce. So hardwiring D&I into everything we do. You might hear and see over the coming months, you know, we're going through a big organisational transformation, and actually a lot of what we do is weaving D&I into the as a red thread through everything that we're working on. When we think about the physical workplace, I think you've probably heard it, and we've just touched on it. There's lots more that we can be doing. I think for us, one of the biggest barriers is, of course, the office environment and that kind of open plan setting, and we're doing lots of work there. But we know getting more diverse talent into engineering is the kind of starting point. And for us, that recruitment process has been a big focus. So we did a full end-to-end redesign of our early careers and what that looks like, right the way from sourcing into actual onboarding, and looked at that with a neurodivergent lens. One of the outcomes of that was actually that we removed the need for CVs for our apprentices, because actually we weren't seeing the value of adding that there. So for me, it starts foundational, and it starts definitely in the kind of the pipeline in our talent space. And I'll leave that there before I keep talking.
Wow, brilliant. Thank you, Natasha. Neil.
Yeah, good afternoon. So Neil Smith, I'm the inclusive design lead for HS2. Also have a different role as well. I'm also the chair of the London Legacy Development Corporation's Built Environment Access Panel. That's a panel who advise LLDC in review of all the developments in the Olympic Park legacy development, bringing a lived experience to the review of designs. From a HS2 perspective, as an inclusive design lead, I own our technical requirements around that, and we have been accredited with the first infrastructure body to be recognised by the Construction Industry Council's Inclusive Environments Recognition Scheme for an organisational level, which I think is a very important piece in terms of its being able to demonstrate we're meeting their six principles about having that leadership at board level, having an inclusive design strategy, actually having it in the brief and embedded in our procurement. So it's critical that we build that in right from the outset to challenge what is being built for us to make that right. And from a workplace setting, I think people may think of HS2 stations, but actually, we're delivering our depots where we will be looking after engineering our rolling stock. And one of the first challenges we got when I got the brief for that was the assumption that disabled people don't work in depots because it's a complex environment, and that is the wrong assumption. So we need to challenge assumptions people make about the different workplace settings, and progress with getting people's knowledge into that. You know, and an existing one, as you say, Leslie, make the changes. You know, one of the things that we've done for our offices is we've had access audits done for our offices, so we actually are getting a formal confirmation of what the barriers are that we can then work through and challenge to make it a better workplace setting.
Thank you, Neil. Paris.
Hi everyone, I'm Paris Wilson. I'm the Inclusive Design Strategy Lead for a consultancy called Motion Spot, and I'm also the project lead for the Inclusive Design Overlay to the REBA Plan of Work that came out in August of last year. So yeah, delighted to be here. Thanks for having me. I guess in response to your question, which is about barriers in the work environment, I'll keep it short and just say I think it's really important to engage with people with lived experience. And I think that often we have an intention to do that, but then the pressures of could be processes or demands, you know, targets mean that we bypass that step. Where we can, it's really important to engage with people with lived experience, understand those barriers, do an inclusive design / access audit, and kind of understand what the challenges are so you can move forward.
Brilliant, thank you. So, as usual, I'm going to break slightly with tradition. I'm going to kind of ask two questions to the panel at once. Stand by. When we're looking at change and whether it's retrospective change or whether it's change for a new organisation moving forward. So I've got a question that I'm going to start with, Neil, which is around how easy is it to do D&I change retrospectively? I get you can design it from the beginning, and I guess that's probably what you did with HS2. How easy do you think it would be to do it retrospectively? And how do you address the pushback that is inevitable with any aspect of implementing change, but even more so, I think, with change that some might not wish to see happen? So I'm going to start with you, Neil, because you can answer the first part, and then we'll move around.
Yeah, retrospective, I think it's an interesting one. Yeah, I remember a conversation I had many years ago with quite a senior partner in an engineering firm that were talking about their offices, and he was of the view that there were no disabled people working for his organisation. The reason being is he couldn't see a wheelchair user within the office, and was particularly strong reason why there wasn't a wheelchair user, because you couldn't get in the front door. So there was a challenge about the building. So that retrospective change, actually it's getting the senior buy-in to understanding the importance of the change, because that delivers you a budget to actually progress on it. Because if you don't have that budget, you can come in and try and make your physical changes, but if you don't have the buy-in to the money to actually then deliver on it, then you're just tinkering rather than actually really affecting change.
Okay. Who wants to go next? Leslie?
If I can pick up on that point about budget, actually, I think one of the key things in answer to both of your questions is really helping people to understand why it's important, and therefore that, you know, retrospective change, it's a little bit like the adjustment that I mentioned in the introduction. It shouldn't be viewed as a cost, it should be viewed as an investment. Because if you can really understand the why, then that will make it clear why that investment is not just important but essential. And I think I would answer your second question, if I can go there, in the same way, which is pushback is often rooted in a lack of understanding or a lack of acceptance of the reason why this is important. And therefore, if you can go right back to the beginning and help people and do it in a polite way, do it in a place that comes from understanding that maybe they're not where you are on the journey, but help to educate, help to support people in developing and building that understanding, then you will get the answer to both of those questions much more easily.
Brilliant. Natasha?
Yeah, I definitely build on the why. I think it's important to hook into why creating an inclusive culture is important to someone on a very personal level, because that then creates a completely different working environment, one where people feel psychologically safe. And I think, you know, one of the things that we do at Rolls-Royce is actually we've spun the conversation and focused on understanding exclusion a little bit more, because more often than not, if you say to a room of people that maybe are pushing back on inclusion and say, well, have you ever felt excluded? And you make it very personal and ask them to reflect on that and that feeling, because to be excluded is a very visceral thing, and it evokes so much reaction within people. So that's one of the things that we've done. And then I think it's that, like you say, building on the why and making it hooked into that reason for people's purpose. We get lots of pushback around it. You know, I think it was in the papers earlier today around the idea of woke, and that we still get that spoken about and talked about. But I also think it's not about just focusing on a minority, because if minorities could fix the problem of inclusion, it would have been done 30 years ago. It's about actually, you know, focusing efforts on the majority. So for us, you know, we've got an 80% male workforce. So, you know, thinking proportionally about the way you tackle things and the way you focus on things and getting into that mindset has been really pivotal for us.
Yeah, thank you, Louise.
I was wondering if you could repeat the question, please.
So it was really about how do you improve diversity and inclusion behaviours within an organisation retrospectively, so that was the first part to it. And then how do you address pushback from any sort of change, but particularly D&I, perhaps change that you're trying to implement. But as you say, it's not about so much changing as embedding. What you really want is a practice that endures, rather than having to go around the cycle again in another 10 years' time. So just...
Okay, fab. So I think I've got 2 points. The first is around democracy and basically getting everyone's voice heard. I think sometimes we're uncomfortable with sitting with those who might challenge what we feel is kind of the right thing to do. And I think actually the most important thing is to kind of get everyone in the room, hear everyone's voices, so that they can be part of creating that change to influence the D&I initiatives. And I also think when developing the case for change, we need to go beyond the economic case for change. So I work sometimes with clients to look at inclusive design, create inclusive design strategies and business cases. And often they will ask for the economic, the financial return on investment. And then I'm just rebellious and put that at the last section of a PESTLE analysis, and choose to actually look at, you know, moral, political, social, all the other things, and then economic comes right down at the bottom. Of course, it's a good thing to do financially, but challenge the idea of just making change, you know, rooted in because we can make money. And I think often the business case sits there. So I think creating a business case that looks at different dimensions and at the same time democratic approach, bringing everyone along the journey. That's how I would answer
Well, and
that.
also it speaks to the social part of the ESG agenda.
Yeah.
These days, in my view, we have a lot more employees that really want to do the environmental, want to do the social bit. They kind of want the governance to be done, but in an inclusive way that means that we can do the environmental and the social bit. But that doesn't mean without profit, but it does mean you put people and planet first before the profit.
Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. Right, I'm going to go to the audience. Have we got anybody who has a question? Gentleman there.
Thank you for all the insights already. I'm Henrik, part of Pure Affinity. So my first question is, you all have all sorts of great experiences, but what have been some of the big lessons learned in the last couple of years, where we've seen this wave of interest in our field with the Black Lives Matter in the 2020, and then a pushback in the last year, which is crazy, because we all benefit from this space, but just keen to get your lessons learned and how you tackle some of those objections that we face.
Yeah, difficult. Anybody got any instant thoughts?
I'm happy to go. Yeah. I think diversity fatigue is very real, and I think that comes from sustaining momentum over a period of time where I think diversity and inclusion activity specifically has been very focused on maybe more kind of events and activities and kind of key moments in time. And I think for us it's about creating that sustained change and momentum and helping people on that journey and kind of battling through some of that fatigue. But I think, listen, there's always going to you're always going to have people with different viewpoints, but I think one of the things that we seem to be moving away from, or we're losing, or maybe it's there, but people maybe feel afraid, is to have those healthy disagreements in the workplace. And I think where we do need to get to, and one of the things that I talk about a lot, is we can go into a room and we can have completely opposing views, and that's okay. Like, I don't expect people to go into a room and then everyone think how I do. That's not inclusive. That's not the way we want to be doing business. We need that healthy disagreement. We need that healthy challenge. And the ability to say, I'm going to sit here, I'm going to follow our values, I'm going to show you dignity and respect, and that's going to be two-way. And we might not change perspectives, but actually you leave the room having listened actively to one another. And that might, in time, create some different thought processes and change. But for me, that's key to how we kind of switch the narrative.
So can I just ask a follow-up to that then? So it's great that you have a conversation and that you challenge or support as necessary. How do you make the decision, though? How does the decision get made that everybody walks out the room thinking, yeah, okay, I was listened to, might not agree completely with the solution, but there was a decision process that meant that I was fully included?
So I think that's part of like having people leaders that are kind of leading that conversation, and they're demonstrating those inclusive behaviours. Ultimately, there's always going to be that accountable person, but it's ensuring that accountable person has created that psychological safety in the room. They are encouraging that conversation, you know, and then taking those recommendations from people and taking them forward. You know, we talk about our CEO, so Tufan talks about, it might not have been him, so I probably shouldn't name check him. But the exec team talk about naming the elephant. So actually have that conversation in the room. When that decision's made in the room and you walk out, you support it. So whether it was that you all just agree to disagree, or whether actually there was a final decision made, certainly in the leadership space, you name the elephant, because if you walk out and then start talking about the elephant, actually that's not healthy or conducive to psychological safety.
Okay, brilliant, thank you.
I was a different view, but just, you know, one of the joys I have about working at HS2 is actually EDI is incredibly high on the agenda. We were the first organisation that got the platinum accreditation from Clear Assured for our work on EDI, and part of that, we also, evidence for getting the platinum accreditation was our design approach. Yeah, that was built in. But that's something that we pass down to our supply chain as well. So, you know, our tier one suppliers also have to get it's a requirement to get accreditation. We report on our commitment every year, but we also report on our supply chain's commitment. So to work for HS2 actually means to buy into our EDI commitments, and I think that comes down from top level of the organisation and follows through. So where we have conversations about change, and people will obviously recognise that there is change with HS2 at the moment, and we have our all staff calls with the chief exec. One of the topics that comes up from the floor is EDI, and people feel quite confident to challenge the chief exec on EDI matters. So I think, you know, there's work to be done, but there is a platform there that the staff have a voice that is heard and responded to. So it's not just questions asked; those questions are answered.
Nice.
Okay. More than welcome, chip in, or I can ask another question.
I was just going to add one point about Natasha's comment around diversity fatigue, and going specifically to your question around lessons learned. One of my biggest lessons learned has been that difference between diversity and inclusion. And I think when we talk about diversity, you can feel like diversity fatigue. There's this aspect of diversity or that aspect of diversity, and we have to talk about them all separately, and everybody wants to, you know, to add the bit that's most important to them. And therefore it becomes quite overwhelming. But actually, when we boil it down to the fundamental changes we want to make, we are all trying to be inclusive, and that inclusivity is common, regardless of any aspect of diversity or any aspect of difference. What we're saying is we need to acknowledge it, we need to accept it, and going even further, we need to value it, whatever it is. And therefore our approach should be rooted from there, that we should be striving to be inclusive, and that will give us diversity, not striving to be diverse.
Absolutely, the framework.
I don't have any contributions.
Okay,
I think,
all right.
Yeah.
No, that's good.
I don't want to build on what everyone said.
No.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask the Slido question next. I will come back to the audience for another question, but this one's got the most hits so far. And a comment by Marsha, important point been made about inclusion-led approach versus a diversity-led approach, which is exactly what you've just been talking about, in order to consciously mitigate bias. How would you suggest habitual inclusive behaviours can be created? So how do we go about making it inclusive-led rather than diversity-led? Any instant thoughts?
I feel like mind mapping my response first. That's a great question.
I'm happy to go. I think, so one of the things that we've introduced this year is we have a diversity and inclusion scorecard. So we actually keep it now as a key conversation. It's a key point in all of our kind of business reviews that we have to talk about our inclusion index. So we don't just talk about our representation, actually we talk about how inclusive is the environment that you're leading. We also have something we launched just in January, actually, our Inclusion Champions Network. So these are people that volunteer to kind of help us embed the strategy at a local level. So that's a couple of things that kind of came to mind straight away.
Brilliant, thank you. Paris, she's still mind mapping.
Still in my head, I'm still, yeah.
I think some of the things that on the inclusion side are just basic, and it just comes back to how we design and manage the workplace, just getting some of the basics right. If we're not, if we're not thinking about what the physical environment is that people are working in, are we excluding them just because they're not able to get into the front door, or don't feel that they have the strength to come into the front door, and that workplace environment is there. So actually thinking and recognising that workplace environment. One workplace environment doesn't work for everybody. In this session before, some of the things that we're talking about, the one thing I think that comes out strongly from all that conversation is the ability to choose the environment that you work in and feel that you've got the right to ask for that. And that could be a physical adjustment. It could be working remotely at odd hours, but that's all part of that work environment.
And a key point that you just made there, I think, is about that flexibility in working pattern. Now, I don't know how easy that is to do with HS2, but did you manage to be able to get people to work remotely on something that is such an engineering sort of design?
Working on a building site, that's flexibility working doesn't happen, but working in from the actual management and oversight and design, yes, you can build in that flexibility, and we still are continuing to reflect on how to do that, and we've on a very personal level, I'm part of the Together Network, which is our disability staff network allies, and we've just run a session recently talking about what it's like to be a parent of a disabled child. My child is 28, so not really a child anyway, but I'm still a carer for him. But that it was quite heartening to have different parts of the organisation, members of staff, come through for an online session, just to talk about our experiences and how the company has supported us with our flexible working to allow us as carers to still do our job and reflect on the demands that puts on us, and to give us the flexibility.
Can I just build on that?
Yeah.
I definitely think flexibility is important, but I do think that as organisations we have to think about flexibility in its broader sense. And I think often at the moment, certainly, we talk about flexibility in as much as hybrid. So, people wanting to work from home, etc. But I think we need to remember that flexibility is very broad, job shares, 9-day fortnights, part-time working, term-time working, and there will be lots and lots of different options out there, especially in organisations where potentially, someone needs to be on site. And we find that a lot of our workforce who are in our plants or factories actually do the 9-day fortnight because that works better for them, etc. And I think, for me, it's about definitely broadening that out when we're thinking of flexibility.
I mean, have you seen a lot of that in the organisations that you're consulting with, Paris?
Well, I would say, so I'm not a D&I practitioner in terms of people and culture. I work in the world of inclusive design of the built environment, and that's sort of where my specialism is. And I guess what I would say, just to speak to Marsha's question, inclusion today is us all being provided one of these fidget toys as an option if you'd like it. If there was a diversity approach, there would be conversations that happened prior to individually to identify what adjustments or what things people need in this space. And that could have also happened in the background, but actually by way of this all being provided, by way of it being, I'm going to have an inclusion mindset in the way of creating this conference, we've all got this option here for us and you feel included. And that to me is the power of inclusion. Diversity is important, but I think when you focus on inclusion, you bring out the diversity in the space, and that's what I'd add, yeah.
Excellent, thank you.
Agree. Just to build a final point, I think the way that we introduce sessions, conferences, meetings, discussions, the way we use our language can very quickly turn people off if we get it wrong, and therefore people can feel excluded. My very favourite example is working in a male-dominated industry, getting an email that says, "Gents and Leslie."
Oh, yeah.
Nothing like feeling like an afterthought, you know, and it really doesn't, and I know the mindset is, I'm including you by adding you to my collective noun of gent, but I'm flagging that you're different and I'm making you feel right out there on your own. And so I always politely came back and actually said, all has got less letters than gent.
Exactly.
It's easier to say. And it's more inclusive, but there is a language, I think, part that we haven't talked about yet that can really set the scene for inclusivity and really turn words into actions that makes people instantly feel like the arms are around them rather than the arms are dividing them out and setting them off to one side.
No, absolutely, and at least you're addressed by your name. I just got gent. There you go.
That's progress.
Progress. But we'll move it on. So, are there any other questions in the room before I go back to Slido? Oh, there's a lady there. If someone's got a microphone.
I don't mind speaking. Dame Sue and Leslie, as you come from a background of working in events, have you found that trying to now I've got the mic. Have you found that trying to have conversations around diversity and inclusion have been more difficult in your areas, especially as culturally it's never really been something that was as important, and now it's more important than ever? How have you found trying to have those conversations with teams that you work with or in organisations that you work with, especially in the defence area?
So, shall I go first?
Go ahead.
So, it's better, but I will be completely honest, right at the very beginning, it was easier to become one of the boys, one of the team, because it wasn't done deliberately. It was that we're very used to having males. Yes, you're recognised for the value that you bring, but it's a very team-orientated, being in the services, being in the military, and you want to be one of the team. So there's a very fine line between standing out and being one of the team. So in my defence, I probably tried too hard to be one of the team, so I would let it slide. And then as you become, as you progress further and further, you suddenly think, actually, do you know what, this is not right. But not only that, as more females followed you have to do something to make that much clearer. You're still part of the team, but you have, you're a different gender, or if we at that point had people with a different, neurodiversity, but of course you'll appreciate that the services are not quick to recruit neurodiverse because we didn't understand it. Now it's much better, don't get me wrong, and there are champions and advocates, and we've got one in the room that I know has done an awful lot of work, specifically for the Air Force. So it is better, but you have to stand up for it in the end, you have to kind of say, look, you know, I would appreciate if we did address the gender or indeed any of the other conflicts that are in the room, because it really isn't done it isn't done on purpose. It's done because you want to be part of one team so that you can act instantaneously, and it is different when you go on operations, but there's still a way to go, and you'll see that just from the recruiting has got better. But for us, it's now about recruiting the right people to do the right skills that are not necessarily on the front line. So you need different skills for different parts of the service and the suppliers that you're working with, industry that you're working with. So I would suggest that I was probably partly to blame by wanting to blend in, but there comes a point where you have to stand up for what you believe in, and for those that follow after you. I'm not sure if that's the same for Leslie.
I would absolutely echo all of that, and I know that I did that in my early career, and that's exactly the reason why I'm sat here, because I've looked back and gone, oh gosh, I tried to fit in. I didn't make the point that being different didn't matter and actually could be a strength. I think there are pros and cons to being a little bit behind as well. I think sometimes when you get closer to getting it right, if I can say that, then the need to do something becomes less obvious to the people who aren't looking for it. And therefore, actually, I think we have an opportunity in defence and in engineering, and combine those two together, even more of an opportunity to make a real point. There is clearly a problem. We can't deny that there's a problem, and therefore we have to talk about it. And that can be a benefit, but that can then leave you open to that pushback of, well, are we now only focusing on this? Are we doing too much? And therefore going about it in the right way, and going about it in a way that brings people along on the level of understanding where we can, and some may never quite get there, but bringing the critical mass along the journey is something that we have to do. And if you almost go too far, you disconnect from the people that you need to bring along with you. So I think there are definitely pros and cons to it. I think we need to make the most of the opportunity that we have to say this is, it's borderline a crisis. You look at the numbers, it is not where it should be. There's no biological, genetic reason why we shouldn't be in a better position, and therefore there's something social going on that we need to address. We have an opportunity to sort of slap people in the face with that a little bit, but we can't do it too much, because then you've lost them, and that's quite a fine line, as you said.
And I think we all know that there is a skills, the talent, that skills that we have out there are across the whole of the population, and therefore we need to be recruiting from the whole of the population. We can only do that by being inclusive and understanding how we make the best of the talent that is out there. Because if we don't, we're just going to end up very homogeneous, if indeed you can recruit the numbers that you need to recruit, especially in the technical disciplines. So we owe it to ourselves and the rest of society to basically include everybody so that we get the best to do what we need to do. Okay, I'm going to go to Slido, I think, probably for my last question-ish. So it says, on bias, how do we empower staff to challenge bias when a lot of engineering companies think they have a good ED&I policy, but only use it to tick a box and not address the biases and empower diverse people to mount the career ladder? I think this is really important. How do we make leaders walk the talk? Brilliant question. Who'd like to go first?
Am I able to just read it as well?
Yeah,
Is that all right?
yeah,
Thank you.
sure. It's the top one.
While you're ready, I'll open. I think there's a very important, well, there's two bits to the way I would answer the question. One is about making space for the people who maybe aren't yet able to make that space for themselves. I think we have to advocate for difference. And I think that if we do that, that action shows that you're walking the talk. I think that makes a big impact, both on the people who are then feeling included, but also the people who maybe stumbled over it and got it a little bit wrong. So I think helping to protect that space for people, invite people into the conversation, ensure that they feel included. If they don't feel that they can do that themselves, and maybe the culture or the environment isn't quite there where they can do that themselves, I think that's an aspect we haven't talked about yet.
No, indeed. Tasha?
I don't think that there's definitely not one fix. Someone asked me this question yesterday, what's the one thing you would do to make the workplace more inclusive? And I was like, well, there's definitely more than one. And so I don't think there's just one answer to bias. I think we have to acknowledge the fact that bias is within all of us, and I think that's the starting point that you kind of need to get every person, every organisation to kind of acknowledge and go, we're all biased, you know. I'm in this room now, and if there's somebody in here that's Northern, I will seek them out and have an immediate affinity to them because immediately I've found a connection, and everyone, you smile, but it's very true. And I think that's the starting point, is kind of acknowledging that. But then for me, it's about, in my role, reviewing the data to see where it is playing out. So for me, I look through, for example, in the talent space, I look at our recruitment funnels. So from an external and an internal perspective, I go through every layer of the recruitment process, and I look at it through a diversity lens. And I then look at, okay, where is that percentage changing? What's affecting that? And really pull it apart and put it back together again, and then go and look at the insights and have those questions. And I think, to broad stroke, but with engineers, when you take the data to them and you have that conversation, certainly with leaders, you can demonstrate where we think there's something happening. That's very, very helpful.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Data is key. There's no point having a policy in place if you actually don't measure it, if you actually don't understand whether it's been implemented or not, and that needs to be reported to all levels of the company.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Therese?
Yeah, I was going to say, get everyone together and explore your ways of working and personality types. And the reason that came up for me is because it's a way, and I know we're talking about the people who are essentially resistant. I think the question is alluding to those who don't really want to see the change. But that humanistic connection is what makes people feel really equal and kind of safe, and that psychological safety. So if we all get in a room and then start looking at, oh, you know, you might see me whiteboarding my thoughts whilst you're all sitting there, listening to you might see me on the whiteboard mind mapping, and then all of a sudden that same leader's gone, gosh, I mind map as well, I really enjoy doing that. And all of a sudden you found these sort of similarities. You start to break down this sort of idea that by way of being kind of given a label, because I think labels have caused us so many problems. Yeah. We're all just these humans together, and these labels have meant that people kind of try and find these terms and ways of describing people that kind of pulls us away from that sort of personal connection. So I think if there's ways to kind of find those similarities and ways of working, and cognitive diversity is such a great place to start, because you start to see just how similar some people are and how different. And then from there, that leader, so to speak, might look across all these sorts of ways of working, passports and this information, and learn more about their teams, learn more about themselves, and realise that they're, equal.
Absolutely. But it, to your point, is about actually walking.
Yeah.
You need to actually walk the talk. You can't have a policy in place that sits on the shelf. A, you don't measure it, and B, you don't actually espouse it. You don't actually get out there and walk the talk, which is not necessarily easy in the hybrid environment that we work in. That's quite hard to do. But again, that's another challenge for another conversation. Okay, I think, right, we are down to almost the end of the session. So what I'd like, before we say thank you to the panel members, is for you to address give one final insight. As champions of inclusive design, what is the one thing you'd ask the audience to consider in their practice to support a future where inclusivity is seamlessly integrated into every aspect of engineering, design and development? So if there's one thing that you would offer the audience as a practice, good practice, to allow us to be a much more inclusive organisation, community, environment, whatever it is, what would that be?
I think for me it would be to put inclusivity at the heart of our decision making. The phrase has always been build it and they will come, not build it, see who complains about it, and then change it a little bit.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you.
I think for me it's be curious, actively listen and have a person-centred approach.
Fantastic.
I think it has to be a corporate commitment. I think it has to be something that you be inclusive, but actually have something to measure against, put KPIs against it to check what you're doing is right.
Which is not necessarily easy to do either, is it?
No.
It's quite hard to put KPIs to something that is
Indeed.
A behaviour.
I would say mobilise a group of people with different lived experience, and I mean that across all protected characteristics and beyond, to be honest. And then, you know, get a specialist in, an inclusive design or access consultant to support with doing an audit in consultation with the people with lived experience, understand your environment and the barriers, and then change, make those changes accordingly.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Right, I would like, if you would, please, to thank everybody in the audience. Thank you, panel members, and we'll stay still.
Brilliant. Oh, I'll just echo that. Thanks. Thank you so much to our panel. A really deep and engaging discussion. And yeah, I think we're all really. You gave us so much food for thought. So much food for thought. I've been scribbling away in my notebook over there, and I can see that lots of people were doing the same in their action plan. So I think there's lots that we can now take back into our organisations. Now, to help us to cement that, what we're going to do is we are going to open out for some table talks and some table discussions. We are going to be able to share our practice and kind of really reflect on the wisdom that's been shared from our two panels this morning, as well as being able to bring our own reflections from our own walks of life into the discussion. Now, each group is going to have the chance to discuss insights and actions around one of the two themes from this morning. So either creating space for cognitive diversity or breaking bias and building understanding. In your groups, so whether on your table or those online you'll be putting to breakout groups shortly, please choose one theme to discuss. It would be wonderful if you could ensure that there's someone on your table that's happy or in your group that's happy to be able to report back to the room a little bit later. I'll talk a bit more about that now. So if you're here with me in the room, on your tables there are some prompt questions and the key themes that are printed out for you already. At the end of the discussion time, we'll bring the roving mics around and you'll have an opportunity to feedback. So please select one person that can feedback and you'll have about a minute. I'm going to be really strict on timings because we all want to have lunch. So we'll have about a minute to be able to feedback. Then those, oh, hold on one second. I still need to tell online what they're going to do. 1 second, please. So those of you who are online with us, shortly you'll be invited to join a breakout room. Just press join on your screen and it should take you straight there. Your camera and microphone will be unfrozen and you'll have the opportunity to be able to see other delegates and really talk freely and share your insights. Each group can choose again their own recommendation to discuss or their own one of the themes to discuss, and a link to a form, an online form, has been entered into the chat for you, which has the prompt questions, and it also has space for you to be able to write your reflections. So please choose one person from your group online to be able to share your reflections back, and we'll have someone in the room that will then read those out so then everyone can hear the insights from the whole audience together. I'll leave you to your discussions now. You'll have about 15 minutes. You will, we've got time. You'll have about 15 minutes to share your thoughts before we come back together. Our panellists are going to be joining you in the table discussions, but before they leave the stage, I think they deserve another ginormous round of applause, so thank you.